All right, can everyone hear me? I'm going to use a pointer today because I'm going to show you a little bit of data, and it's always hard with two slides, so I'm just going to point over here because I'm right-handed. I was just waving at Roger in the background because when we published our paper in PLOS One, we co-published with Roger's group at Vanderbilt, and I'll mention that as well. So I think the two studies go nicely together. Okay, let's see. All right, so as Michelle said, I am the director of the Biological and Biomedical Sciences program at UNC Chapel Hill. And for some context, we're very similar to WashU, how that was described earlier, or Vanderbilt. We have a large umbrella-style program that serves 14 different PhD programs at UNC, and neurosciences is one of them. And so to give you some sense of scale, we get between 1,200 and 1,400 applications a year. And we have 4 large admissions committees that look at those applications. And we do bring our students in for interviews. We narrow the pool down to about 300 students, and they come to campus. We do it over 6 weekends. It's a total slog. We get exhausted by the end of February. We do all the things you're probably doing for the recruitment side of things. So they're looking at campus, meeting students, doing all of these things. And then they also have 5 one-on-one interviews with faculty, which are part of our decision-making process. And so from those 300 students, we're usually looking to bring in about 80 or 90 students a year. And at UNC, our students come in unaffiliated with the PhD program, so they're sort of undifferentiated. They take classes and do their research rotations, and all the while they are BBSP students. After they finish their research rotations and join a thesis lab, then they leave BBSP, and they go out into one of these 14 different programs. And we have about 400 or so faculty who are a part of these programs. It's totally enormous. Everything we do is big, big, big. And just for fun, since April 15th is right around the corner, we're having a really good year this year, which is very surprising to me since I'm in North Carolina, the land of HB2. And I would have thought that would really hurt our recruiting, but we're having a pretty high acceptance rate, and so I would love to hear and chat with other people about how your admissions is looking, sort of compare numbers. But it's looking like a good year for UNC. Also, the BBSP is part of a larger Office of Graduate Education, and I think this is important for context too. So in addition to the BBSP side of things, we also have a very well-developed professional development staff. We have 2 full-time staff members that run that. We have one of these NIH BEST grants to do internships and career exploration. We have an R25 IMSD grant that does minority recruitment and retention. We have a prep program, so these post-bac programs that Michelle was mentioning earlier, so we have a very successful one of those. We also do all the pipeline stuff we've been talking about. We have the solar program here is specifically for underrepresented students to come and do research at UNC. We also have an NSF SURE RAU program. And then we have a very enthusiastic group of students that like to do outreach, so we serve the state of North Carolina and do DNA Day. And as a side bonus, this is a very good thing for our students to put on their F31 and NSF applications for broader impact. So we have a whole office that serves our graduate students, and personally, I really love coming to work every day. Okay, so let's jump right into my talk. I've divided it into 2 pieces. So first I'm going to talk about our admissions study that Michelle mentioned. And then in the second half, I'm going to talk a few practical things about what we've done at UNC using data to guide our admissions process. Okay, so part 1, our admissions study. And as Michelle said, this was published in January in PLOS One. The title is Predictors of Student Productivity in Biomedical Graduate School Applications. Josh Hall is the lead author, myself, and then Jean Cook, who is our Associate Dean for Graduate Education and Director of our Office of Graduate Education. Okay, so what motivated us to do this study? And really the first thing was experiences of our prep scholars. So Josh, as I mentioned before, the lead author on the paper, directs our UNC prep program. It's been around for, I think, 7 years now. It's been really successful. Our students spend 1 year at UNC. They get professional development, GRE prep, all these other things to make them more competitive to go on to graduate school. And one of the things that Josh noticed was that the GRE seemed to have an outsized influence in how easy or hard it was going to be for these students to get interviews or get offers. So students who did really well in the lab, who had amazing letters of recommendation, if their GRE scores were not very good, they would oftentimes would have a harder time getting interviews. They would get fewer interviews than the students who were maybe just okay, but sort of did well on the GRE. And the GRE was so stressful for these students. It costs money, they know it's important, it's a big part of that prep year. And so this is really what motivated Josh to sort of start to look at what is important in the graduate application and how does that relate to student success. So the second motivation was the 2014 UCSF study. So many of you have probably read this paper, but just very briefly, in case you haven't, this is the article that came out at MBOC in 2014, and what they said at UCSF was, or what they found was that years of research experience and subject to GRE scores differed between their high-performing students and their low-performing students. They did not find a difference between general GREs, GPA, or the undergraduate institution ranking, so this selectivity question. And so, at least for us, this was a really exciting paper, and we talked a lot about it. There were some criticisms, though, and actually, UCSF students published a sort of a response to this paper. And some of the criticisms were that the outcome measures were subjective, so they basically asked the faculty program directors to say who were your best students and who were your lowest performing students, so it's kind of an opinion-based thing. They only had 2 bins, and the sample sizes were pretty small, so 31 in the top group and 21 in the bottom performing group. And at the end of the paper, they recommended that other institutions conduct similar analyses, so that's what we decided to do. And I should mention that BBSP, we started doing this umbrella style admissions in 2008, and our average time to degree is pretty close at 5.5 years, and so starting in around 2015 when we were thinking about this study, we had enough students kind of come through the program and go on to graduate that we could really start to look at this with a good sample size. So the goal that we had was to objectively study application metrics as they relate to student outcomes, and we really wanted to be objective, okay? And so the question that we asked was, do application metrics differ between highly productive and less productive biomedical PhD students at UNC Chapel Hill? And the other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is we were very intentional about using the word productive and not successful, because success can be defined in many different ways. And so we felt that productivity, which I'll talk about in a minute, was a better term. Okay, so very quickly, this is how our study was designed. So we looked at students who came in through the first 3 years of our BBSP program, and that totaled about 280 students in our cohort. The application data that we looked at were the general GRE, the verbal, quantitative, and written. We don't require the subject test at UNC, and almost no one submits the scores, so we couldn't use that like the UCSF group did. We looked at undergraduate GPA, months of prior research experience, recommendation letter rankings, which I'll explain later on, and interview scores from the faculty interviews. And the outcomes that we decided to look at were numbers of first author publications, and we were just talking about that earlier, and we felt that this was a good objective way to compare student productivity. We also looked at degree outcome and time to degree. I don't have time today to show you those data, but they're also in the paper, and we found somewhat similar results. So for the first author publications, I just want to explain how we set the definitions. Most of the programs in the BBSP at UNC require at least 1 first author publication as a degree requirement. And so we felt that we sort of set the average productivity group as 1 to 2 first author papers. Anyone who got more than 2 first author papers, we said was sort of a highly productive student. And then for the students who got no first author papers, we decided to divide them into 2 groups. So there were people who had no first author papers, but at least 1 middle author paper. We felt that that was different than the students who had no authorship on any paper of any kind in any position. So that's how we created 4 bins. All right, so I'm just going to jump right into the data and just show you a few of the slides, and then we will get into the practical parts in a second. very quickly. So how did we analyze the student publications? So Josh actually wrote a custom Python script that mined PubMed for the advisor and student last name pairs. And then that returned the number of first author publications for the student and the total number of publications. And so that's how we sort of counted publications. And we get lots and lots of questions about this, so I'm just going to go ahead and say that all first author publications were considered equal in our study. So we didn't look at, for example, we didn't differentiate between a review or a primary research article. We also made no attempt to assess quality or impact factor. There's a lot of issues with those metrics anyway. And we also didn't consider, all the non-first author positions were considered equal. So if you were a co-first author but your name was listed second, it didn't get counted as a first authorship. And so we pretty much just looked for the number of publications, divided them into groups, and just went ahead and did the study. And we may have seen some different results if we tried to dig down in there a little bit more. We decided not to do that. Any questions about that? Okay. So the first question we asked was the question that we've all been talking about: do the GRE scores have any relationship to these productivity groups? And it was not surprising to us that they were not predictive. And I just want to show you what the data look like. I'm going to walk you through this one chart because all the other ones are going to look the same. So what we've done here is plotted our productivity groups along the bottom. So this is the high productive group, the middle productive group, and the two lower groups. And then each dot represents an individual student. And we've just plotted them based on their quantitative GRE percentile here on the y-axis. This line right here is the mean, and these are the standard deviations. Okay, so all the charts are going to look like this. And this is what we see for the quantitative GRE score, which is one that gets talked about a lot in admissions committees. There is no difference between the highest productive students and the lowest productive students. I also want to point out there's a pretty good range. We had some students with pretty low quantitative GRE scores in our pool. Oh, so we found the same for verbal and writing GRE scores. This was back in the day when the written was the old way that it was done. Now it's the 1 through 5 number. And for any of you who serve on admissions committees, you're probably not surprised by the writing scores being all over the map. It's kind of always like that. But we saw no difference for any of these individual metrics between our highest productive students and our lowest productive students. And this result is consistent with the UCSF finding, and it's also consistent with the Vanderbilt publication that came out the same time as us. And Roger, feel free to add if I don't get everything in here. So they did a very nice study looking at what does the GRE predict during graduate school, if anything at all. And they've been around, their umbrella program's been around a lot longer than ours, so they had more students in their pool, 634. And what their study showed was that the GRE, somehow I've gotten out of my slide, here we go, is not predictive of who will complete their PhD, time to degree, who's going to pass their qualifying exam, the number of presentations at conferences, the number of publications that relates to our study, and who is able to get external fellowships or grants. So they did find, however, that there is a moderately predictive for grades and first-year courses, and this is consistent with some of the research that says that GRE is a pretty good or an okay predictor at how you'll do in the classroom. But as we know, that's only one part of what it takes to be successful in graduate school. I think also you looked at advisor ratings of students as well and sort of split along the same line, right? So who they thought were the most productive and likely to go on and be successful, the GRE score didn't seem to predict that. So this was encouraging to see this correlation with the Vanderbilt study, with the UCSF study, and the reason that we care so much about GRE, we've already talked about that today, right? It has this seemingly outsized role in graduate admissions. And the one thing that we do know is that GRE is a pretty good predictor of your race or your gender or your socioeconomic status. And so, in fact, I just read an article, it was an Atlantic article, where the person said GRE is proxy for are you white, are you rich, are you male? And so just to show you that this is true at UNC too, this is how our GRE scores break down by racial and ethnic categories. And so you can see that students in these underrepresented groups definitely underperform this is quantitative, but same for the others relative to white and Asian students. And the same is true for males versus females. And so I've sat on a lot of admissions committees. I've been doing this since 2007. And people really love scores like in the 70th percentile or higher. So if you were to just draw a cutoff, right, I thought this was good to look at, you would completely eliminate some groups of people, and it's really a bad way to have a good diversity strategy. So I think we all are in agreement here that the GRE is not the greatest predictor, but a lot of people were sort of hungering for these data, and so I think it's important just to show them. Okay, so yes?
I just had a question. Do you build into any of these studies whether people have taken the prep test for the GRE? It seems like that's
no, and probably the people who could afford to did.
No, obviously,
yeah.
But that's my point.
Yeah, yeah. No, in fact, I just read an article this morning, maybe in the Times or in Inside Higher Ed, about how to take the GRE or how to take the SAT like a pro. And it was a student who got admitted into this summer program and realized that all these rich, white kids were just studying for the SAT with intensity, like, and from where he was, most people thought about it once, took it, and did whatever. And so, yeah, I think, our prep students can sometimes increase their scores with the GRE prep that we do, but not as much as what it might take under the classical definitions. Yeah?
Our finding is that the best predictor coming out of the GRE is what you get if you take it the second time. There may be small increases, but it's a lot of money.
It's like $200 or something, yeah, to take it. And then you have to pay to send the scores. And, a lot of times we find that applicants will just self-report their scores and then wait to see if they get an interview or get admitted before they pay the ETS to actually send the score to us, because it's such a financial burden to take the test. Okay, so what we were trying to find out is what does predict productivity for graduate students. Is there anything useful in the graduate application? So we found a bunch of other things that don't predict productivity. We first looked at undergraduate GPA. I'm not going to show you the data here today. That's also consistent with the UCSF study. Caveats there, we didn't look at just their science GPA, for example. We just looked at their overall undergraduate GPA, and if you look at that, there's no correlation or no difference between the highest productive students and the lowest productive students. We also looked at numbers of months of previous research experience, and we actually went back and opened all 280 applications and looked at their CVs and counted their research experience. So this was a lot of work, and very surprising to us to find that for our cohort, numbers of months of previous research experience did not differ between our highest productive and our lowest productive students. And this is in contrast to the UCSF finding. So just so you can see the data here for this, again, these are our productivity bins, the highest down to the lowest group, and each dot is a student. And you can see that we had a range of numbers of months of previous research experience, although most people are down here in the sort of 12 months range. We only counted up to December when they submitted their application, so they're probably going to get another 3 to 6 months more before they come to graduate school. But we assume that would be uniform across everyone. And there was no difference between the highest group, no significant difference between the highest publishing group and the lowest publishing group. There are some students with tons of research experience that wound up with no publications. And we could talk about why that might be, or why our result was different from the UCSF group if you want. Their average months of previous research experience in their cohort was like around 2 years. So a lot higher than the UNC group. And I will just say anecdotally that over the years, this was 2008 to 2010, we're starting to see applicants with more and more research experience. So I'm assuming that our averages have gone up, although I haven't actually gone in and looked at it. But we were definitely expecting the people who had tons of research experience, maybe were a technician for a couple of years, hit the ground running, start to publish papers, and that isn't what we found. Okay, so we also looked at faculty interview scores, and we really thought that this would show us something, so we were very surprised by this finding too. And that's a little bit why I asked Julie the question earlier. And now that I think about it, maybe this isn't such a surprising result after all. But you know, why are we doing these faculty interviews, right? We think this is how you get to know the applicants better. You meet them one-on-one, and you can probe a little bit more how much they understood their project and figure out who to admit. So what we did was, as I said, they have 5 one-on-one faculty interviews. The raters submit back to us a couple of ratings and then an overall score, with a 1 being the sort of most enthusiastic score down to a 4. And so we just averaged those overall scores for all the interviewers for any one applicant, and then we plotted that also the same as we've done everything else. You can see there's not a big range. These are the people who we admitted, okay? But most of the people that we interviewed do get an admit offer. I think we admit about 70% of the people that we interview, because we don't have a really high take rate, except for this year. And again, surprisingly to us, the folks that the faculty were the most excited about sort of spread out among these productivity groups. So it doesn't seem like they were, there's a lot of uniformity in who they were enthusiastic about. And the 2 applicants that got all 1s, everybody loved them, are in this no first author, but some middle author publications. Okay, so you know, Josh and I were starting to despair. Is there anything in the graduate application that differs between our student productivity groups? And we sort of drug our feet on the letter of recommendation study, because we didn't think that it would show us anything. And I mean, you've read these letters, right? They're all positive. And so we really felt that this was probably not going to result in anything. And we also were grappling with how to ask this question. So we actually first thought about like text mining or something. My husband works for IBM. Maybe we would have Watson do it. You know, we were just trying to figure out how could we look at these letters. And that was just way outside the scope of what we're doing. But UNC does ask all of our letters of recommendation writers to submit a ranking. Oh, this does not show it very well. So if you submit a letter of rec to UNC Graduate School, before you upload your letter, you have to rate the applicant relative to other students you've worked with. And the ratings are, the top one is exceptional, then outstanding, and so on. And so what we did was we just converted these rankings into a number and did just the same thing that we did with the interview scores, but for the letter writers. Does that make sense? And then we plotted it the same way as we did before, and we were very surprised to find that the students in the higher productivity group had significantly higher average letter writer ranking scores than students in the lower productivity groups. And so we wanted to probe into this a little bit further, and so we asked the question a different way. This second plot kind of confuses people, so let me sort of tell you what we did, and then I'll show you the data. So what we did was, instead of binning the students based on their productivity, their publications, we bin them on the letter writer scores, okay? So we sort of tried to break the students into 4 groups of the highest scores, next lowest, and lowest. And so this is what that looks like. So these are the students who had either all 1s or all exceptionals, or maybe 2 exceptionals and 1 outstanding. So that's the top group, and so on down like this, okay? And then we just plotted the average numbers of publications for each of those recommender score groups. And what you can see is, again, there is a significant difference in the number of publications for the students who got the highest letter writer scores versus the students who got the lowest rankings from their recommenders. So we can also talk about this result and what that might mean. There's a lot of bias in letters of recommendation. There's literature out there about that. On the one hand, I think it does make some sense. These faculty have seen students in the lab doing what it takes to be a scientist and can actually have something useful to say about that. So maybe it shouldn't have been so surprising that we found this, but nevertheless, these are all the data. I'm not going to show you the time to degree or the degree attainment data. Everything was consistent with what we found, except for the recommender ratings don't predict who's going to get a PhD or how long it will take them to get a PhD. And I think that's probably because there's so many factors that go into degree completion. All right, so let me just go through a few limitations of our study and talk to you about what we're thinking, where we want to take this next. So I just want to acknowledge we can only study our enrolled students. We don't know who the thesis advisor student pairings are for anyone who didn't enroll at UNC, so we couldn't really have like a control group. And I do acknowledge that there are bias both in letters of recommendation and in interviews, and that may have confounded the results a little bit. We, of course, don't have any students without research experience in our group, so that just acknowledging that is important. All of our publications were considered equal, so we talked about that already, some of the considerations for how we did the publication binning. And of course, our study didn't account for any other factors that might have impacted this productivity, okay? Which is directly related to our future directions. So we're very interested in studying the effects of the training environment and the advisor on the productivity of the student. These are obviously going to be influential, but what specific factors relate to student productivity? And then we're also very interested in qualitative assessments between our highest and lowest productive students, some of these non-cognitive factors that we've all been talking about. And the idea would be if we could figure out, is it grit and perseverance and all of these things? Is that what is different between those two groups? And that would help us know what to look for on the biomedical graduate application. So I thought I would leave you with sort of our recommendations. And the first one, I think, is pretty clear. We should, at a minimum, de-emphasize the GRE in admissions decisions, or if I had it my way, we would just eliminate it altogether. So I can't convince our faculty to do that. They just are not ready, and I'll talk about why. But the nursing school at UNC has gotten rid of the GRE. So they took it off of their application 2 years ago. So it'll be interesting to see what results come out of that. And the reason why I am excited about that is because at least it shows that our graduate school is open to giving us an exemption. So the GRE requirement is at the graduate school level, not at the BBSP level. So we would have to apply for an exemption. And it shows that they're at least open to the idea. And so I'm very interested in what the nursing school sees. I believe we should continue to prioritize research experience. I think we just need to make sure that what we're focusing on is what that tells you about the student, right? So the potential that they have for being successful, and you can get that from their statement, from the letters of recommendation, and focus less on where they did the research or how many years of research experience they actually have. So it's just sort of looking at it in a different way. You should define your admissions criteria in advance. This comes right out of the implicit bias research and is a good thing to do. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then, of course, we want to look at ways that we could assess these qualifications like grit and perseverance on an application. We're trying to think about that at UNC, so if other people are already doing that, I'm very excited to hear your ideas. And then we all know that we need to work towards this idea of holistic review. Some of the challenges that we have, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, at UNC may just be related to our size. We're doing everything in big numbers, and a small program might be leaner and more able to change quickly. Okay, so I'm going to shift now to talk to you about how we've used this study and other data to sort of shape our own admissions process. And so, like I said, the UCSF study came out in 2014, so that's around the time that we started thinking about this question and what it meant for us at UNC. And we've been very committed to diversity and diversifying our graduate student body for a long time. And I will just say that the formation of our umbrella program is probably the biggest boost to our diversity admissions. So prior to BBSP, we had about, if you added all the BBSP member programs together and looked at the percent URM students and of those programs combined, it was about 6%. And after BBSP started, it shot up into the teens. I think it's just a critical mass group of people forming an identity, a central community, and that really helped us at UNC kind of get going, began playing the game. And we have been doing okay, but we still had a lot of challenges, like in the committee meetings, like what we heard about earlier. So what we decided to do was we put a few new things into place between the 2014 admissions year and got them ready to go for our 2015 admissions year. So the first thing that we did was we started mandatory training for all of our admissions committees. And if anybody else out there is already doing this, kudos to you. We finally started doing it in 2015. Our training had two parts to it. And first I should say Jean Cook, our dean person, she's a faculty member and she did the training. Not me, who is a staff person. I know I'm wonderful, but it's really great to have a peer, a person in sort of a leadership position doing this training. And so Jean talked to the committee members about implicit bias. What is it? Where does it come from? Evidence that it's at play in STEM disciplines, in hiring, and how we can reduce implicit bias. We have an implicit bias researcher at UNC who has given some internal talks, so that was part of Jean's own education. And then we began sharing the results of our own admission studies and other studies about the GRE, trying to educate our faculty members about what the real data were. So the other thing that we did was we did put together a rubric for application review, and I'm happy to share this with anyone who's interested. So before we put this together, what our committee members did when they read applications was they just kind of like rated every part of the application and then gave an overall score. So they rated the statement, they rated letter 1, letter 2. I'm not really sure how this came to pass, but that's what they used to do. And what we put into place starting in 2015, we just had 3 subscores and then an overall score. And each subscore took into account related parts of the application instead of, it de-emphasized individual pieces of the application. That was our goal. And so, for example, the research experience subscore included the quality, however anyone would want to define that, how long they did it, if someone thought that was important, what they learned about the applicant from the letters, how they described their research in their statement. All of those things were supposed to go into the research statement subscore. Does that make sense? We did the same thing for academic preparation, their motivation or potential, and then they had an overall sort of enthusiasm score. And each of those was supposed to have a written part as well. All of our applications have 2 readers. I would love it if we had 3, but we just have too many applications. We actually read all of our applications, so it's quite a lot of work. The other thing that we did is a very operational thing. So we actually had an online workflow for application review. Prior to 2015, we just used spreadsheets, which is why I'm really good at Excel now. And when we were doing it with spreadsheets, you need to summarize large amounts of information, and so we would just have the name of the applicant and a couple of things about them, right? What school they went to, GRE, GPA, something just to give a picture, and then that's who was up for discussion that day in the admissions committee meeting. When we switched to the online system, we didn't show test scores or GPA by default. It's not that the information wasn't available to the committee members, but it wasn't like part of the summary about who we were discussing. And so we were trying to just de-emphasize the GRE a little bit. And since then, we've tried to rearrange our application parts. So the GRE kind of is not the first thing you look at, or the test scores. So we're working on some of those things as well. So here's just a little bit of data about how our UR admissions looked prior to changes. I didn't want to show you all of the BBSP years because the chart would be too big. But on the bottom are all of our application years. And then what I'm showing you are the percent of the BBSP pool which were underrepresented. Does that make sense? So in 2010, the orange line shows that we interviewed, the 17% of the folks that we interviewed were underrepresented minorities. And 16% of our admitted class was underrepresented minorities. All right, and we sort of held steady, although we had one very weird year in 2012, but we're sort of here around the 15, 16, 17% range. And after we implemented these changes, we saw a really big increase. And now we're sort of up around the mid-20s to 25%. And portion of our interviewed pool and admitted pool who are underrepresented students. The percent who applied is kind of like a steady climb, but we really made a jump that year between 2014 and 2015. So we think that it made a difference. And anecdotally, I will say, sitting in the admissions committee meetings, one other thing that I didn't put in here, someone sits in every one of our admissions committee meetings who is very familiar with minority serving institutions, what a competitive underrepresented student looks like, to try to do real-time education of the committee members. I've played that role sometimes. Our director of diversity affairs plays that role quite a lot. And things just got a little easier after we started educating our committee members. It wasn't so much of a advocacy work that had to be done. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide and talk a little bit about challenges. And we can sort of end with this and then talk about that during the discussion time, because I think we're doing well, but we still have challenges that we can overcome. And I have broken them up into 2 sections. So first are just operational things. So under application review, if we're going to get rid of the GRE, and if undergraduate GPA isn't predictive, what the faculty are asking is, how do we evaluate the academic preparation of these applicants? I mean, we don't want to bring someone in who can't cut the coursework and pass their qualifying exams. And you know, I think that if anybody has any really good answers to this, I'm curious to hear them. I think part of it might be looking at their grades in their science courses. That's something that people are definitely doing, so digging into the transcript and actually looking at how they did in their science courses. I think you can also learn something from the interview, asking them about how well they understand their project and get a sense for just sort of their grasp of the material. But it's hard. You're comparing across different institutions. You don't know every single institution or how rigorous the education is there, and so you might have to take a chance, like we talked about earlier. I will say probably this is one big reason why the GRE and stuff hasn't gone away, is because people feel they don't have a tool. Consistently using these review criteria that we put together, I still feel, or I still see that there are some really tough people on the admissions committees and sort of the softies, and how do you, you know, reconcile those 2 things? If you get 2 really tough people as your application scores, you know, that can really take your chances, like we talked about earlier. And so we haven't done any kind of like score correction or anything like might happen at study section, but I don't think that the rubric is a total insulator against some of these implicit biases that are out there. The workload is probably the biggest barrier. So, you know, our faculty members are reading 50 or 60 applications. We have a really short turnaround time, so probably just like everyone else, our deadline's around December 1st. We're trying to race all of you guys to get our interview offers out. We want to get them out before Christmas. That's a lot of files to read in a short period of time, and it's just a lot of work. And we're already involving about 80 or 90 of our faculty in our admissions. Again, we do everything big and centralized. And so to bring more people in to reduce the workload is not practical for us. And so one of the things that I always tell our faculty is we've been reading all the applications, and the one takeaway of our study is we still got to do that. So there's no you know, pre-screening that we can do. And then educating our interviewers is another challenge that we have. So we might have 80 people doing application review, but there's 300 or 400 faculty at UNC, and plenty of people are involved in our interview process. In those 2008 to 2010 years that we were looking at, well, actually every year, even this past year, those faculty members have access to the application. And what you'll see in an interview feedback form is, great student, GREs are terrible, don't admit. You know, and it's like the admissions committee has already vetted them for their you know, suitability, and so the interview comments are kind of not always based on the interview itself, which also has its own issues, but are bringing in application components. And so it's one thing, it's hard enough to get 80 people in a room and give them a lecture about implicit bias and hiring and graduate admissions, but there's no way that we're going to bring all 300 of our faculty in. And so that's a bit of a challenge. And I would love to do structured interviews, but I don't see it as a reality for us at UNC, so we're going to need to think more creatively about that. I mean, we've shared with them our paper and the Vanderbilt paper and other stuff, but it just depends on who reads it. So I put these other challenges under what I call culture change. It's just sort of a one way that I've been thinking about it. And one thing that I've been thinking about is, what is the role of the committee chair? So I've seen a lot of different committee chairs over the years, and some of them seem to really take they have an administrative role. Then they read, you know, just sort of helping to shuttle the applications along. They read their files that they're assigned, but then they don't really lead the admissions committee and sort of drive how the discussions are happening. Some chairs do that naturally and some don't, and I wonder if we should be having more expectations on the committee chair to sort of carry out some of the diversity missions of the university, rather than just saying, these are my colleagues and we'll all decide as a group. So that's something I've been thinking about. They can also play some of these roles of calling out biased comments when they see them, and I've seen some chairs do that well and some not so well. So that's something that I've been thinking about. Even though we're all scientists, the anecdotal evidence is just, I see this coming up again and again. So if people think of their best student they've ever had, or their worst nightmare student they ever had, who had to take their quals 2 or 3 times, and if an applicant looks like the worst student that they ever had, in any way reminds them of their worst student, it's like they suddenly get a harsher review because of that. And it's just interesting that they can't seem to shake those experiences, and it's part of risk aversion and other things. And then finally, I'll just leave you with this idea of looking for the perfect candidate versus looking for someone who's well-suited. And what is our job, right? I mean, we're supposed to be training people. And so are we bringing people in who are publishing papers and ready to go right off the ground, or are we willing to take a risk and maybe bring someone who does need support or development or additional training in an area so that they can actually be successful? And I think at UNC, we have been willing to bring people in who might need remediation in a certain area, and then we have programming in place to support those people, and that's how we can feel comfortable taking some of those risks. That's been a really important part of our strategy. So I thought I would just leave you with one thing. We've already been talking about this, but it's not just enough to admit a more diverse group of people. And so I really like this quote that I read in a Harvard Business Review article: diversity doesn't stick without inclusion. So you really have to think about what kind of environment these students are going to be in when they get to your university. And like we talked about earlier, it starts with their decision about whether or not they'll even enroll, right? So what kind of environment are they seeing when they come to your campus for interview weekends? And what are you going to do to support them while they're there? And I couldn't help but just brag a little bit. UNC is doing really well. Our overall retention graduation rate is 88%, and our UR retention graduation rate is 85%. So I feel like we're doing a good job. We're always trying to do better, but I'm happy to share ideas or talk about anything that we're doing at UNC that people may be interested in. And my acknowledgements, all of my co-authors, and my whole Office of Graduate Education. Thank you.